Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 22. We're talking about methods of gas exchange. We're talking about ways in which animals bring in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So we've talked about a number of methods, a number of strategies so far of doing gas exchange. The simplest and oldest method is integumentary exchange, breathing through your skin. We move on from there to actually a pretty sophisticated method called gills. This is still happens in water. Gills are really fine little fingers of thin-skinned, highly vascularized tissue, so they can strip oxygen from water. And remember, there's not that much oxygen in water. There's only about 3% as much oxygen in water as in air. We move on from gills. We went on to tracheal respiration. We said that tracheal respiration is the way in which bugs will breathe, and that bug blood does not carry oxygen. We did say that there is a gill that works in air, and it's called a book lung. That's specifically something that arachnids will use, a book lung. So let's talk about a real lung. And a real lung is, you can see what this picture is. This is obviously a picture of human lungs. Here we see that trachea coming down. The trachea is going to split in two into the left and right bronchi. And these left and right, obviously the left one feeds the left lung and the right one feeds the right lung. Just like those windpipes that went throughout the body of the bug, these windpipes are going to go throughout the body of the lung. And each time they branch, just like a tree, each branch is narrower than what it came off of. Each time it branches, we get thinner and thinner and thinner. And we'll talk about the actual structure of this in a while. But they branch all the way down to essentially tiny little balloons. Tiny little balloons that inflate with air, that have blood vessels on the back side of them that can then take the oxygen from the air. Lungs were actually first developed by fish, crazily enough. And there are still some fish today that possess lungs. Guess what they're called? Lungfish. Crazy, right? Lungs were the first organisms, the first animals to make lungs. Did I say that really? Fish were the first animals to make lungs. We move up from fish to amphibians, and amphibians do use lungs. Remember, most fish will use gills. And even those lungfish have gills too. They just have both. They have gills and lungs. They're able to do two methods of gas exchange. Though, as we said before, fish really don't do that much integumentary exchange. We move on from fish to amphibians. Amphibians do lots of integumentary exchange. So they do have lungs, but they're not terribly efficient, just like the fish lungs. They have lungs, but they're not terribly efficient. Why not? Well, how are they probably doing most of their gas exchange? They're doing most of their gas exchange with gills. And again, those lungfish, pretty much the whole reason why they have lungs is what we talked about before. In the hottest parts of the summer, what happens to the amount of oxygen in water? Goes way down, and those fish will literally come up to the surface and gasp and gulp, big drinks of air so that they can have enough oxygen to keep going. Fish make pretty inefficient lungs. Amphibians make better lungs, still not terribly efficient, and there are actually entire groups of amphibians that don't have lungs. There's a whole group of salamanders called the lungless salamanders. They don't have lungs at all. When we talked about the hellbender, we said its name was Cryptobranchus. Crypto means hidden, branch means lung. The name was Cryptobranchus, hidden lung. They're like, an animal this big has to have lungs, and it doesn't. It must, we just can't find it. Well, what kind of exchange do most of our amphibians do? They do integumentary exchange. But there are amphibians that have lungs. There are lots of amphibians that have lungs. Almost all frogs, I think all frogs actually, have lungs. All right? So we move on from fish that make inefficient lungs to amphibians that make better lungs to reptiles. Remember, when we made that big jump from amphibians to reptiles, what was the major change between the two groups of animals? That major change was the skin. Amphibians have slimy skin. Why? If you're going to do integumentary exchange, what was the caveat? What was the condition you had to have to do integumentary exchange? And the answer is the skin has to be wet. That's why frogs and salamanders and toads have slimy skin, because it has to be wet so they can breathe. You make that jump from amphibians to reptiles, and now we don't have slimy skin anymore. Now we have scales. Scales are hard, scales are dry. You can't breathe through them. You don't have to have great lungs if you can still do a lot of breathing through your skin. What if you can't do any breathing through your skin? What do you need now? You need much better lungs. And so reptiles have far more efficient lungs than amphibians do. However, reptiles are what kind of animals? They are cold-blooded, ectothermic. If they're ectothermic, what does that mean for their oxygen requirements? Their oxygen requirements are actually fairly low, which is why they can hold their breath for a long time, which is why snakes can stay underwater for a long, long time, why turtles can stay underwater for a long time. They have low oxygen requirements. They take a big, deep breath of air, and they stay underwater for like 20 minutes because they don't have to be able to breathe for very much. We move on from reptiles. Oh, one other thing. We said there was no warm-blooded animal that breathes water. There are no reptiles that breathe water. None. There are lots of reptiles that spend a lot of their lives, even most of their lives, in water. There are none that breathe water. And all of them have to come out on land to lay eggs. Think of sea turtles, even sea snakes. Think of alligators and crocodiles. Any of these mostly aquatic reptiles, A, all of them lay their eggs on land. B, none of them breathe water because there's not enough oxygen in water for them. We move on from reptiles to mammals. Mammals we've made that huge jump. That huge jump from being ectothermic, and now we are endothermic, which means we have these huge, huge oxygen requirements. So mammals have much more efficient lungs than reptiles do because we have to have them. Notice the last group, and the last group is birds. This list is organized from least efficient lungs to most efficient lungs. And when we see that birds, isn't that surprising? Wouldn't you think that mammals would have the most efficient lungs? And that's not the case. The case is that birds have the most efficient lungs. Because what do birds do that other animals don't? And the answer is that they fly. Flying is the most energy-demanding method of locomotion. It's also the most energy-efficient method of locomotion. Bird lungs are extremely efficient. They're far different from mammalian lungs. Really, really different from mammalian lungs. And we'll look at those in just a bit.